Well, good morning. This is the ICT Educator webinar series for the fall of 2020, and I'm Steve Wright. I'm the statewide director of the ICT sector team, which includes 10 regional directors. You can find them on our website. Diligent people looking for ways to engage with employers and bring knowledge about jobs and skills to the community college system in the area of ICT and digital media. We have been augmenting our efforts with this ICT Educator series now. We have over 35 recorded webinars in various subject areas, as you can see. A lot of these include successful how-to techniques by faculty or sometimes by subject matter experts today, such as Peter Coffey. And each webinar is recorded, video recorded, and then edited down to get rid of my awful oohs and ahs and everything else, and then chapterized and transcripted so you can actually read it. And of course, the PowerPoint presentation as well. You can use these in your classroom. You can use them for grant writing and everything else. Is a wonderful resource. So we've had over 3,500 views to date, and we're going to be going all year, fall and spring. Coming up in the next few weeks, we're going to look at the cloud curriculum pathways that are being developed in the Bay region. Our team of RDs have been working up there. It's a kind of like making legislation. You don't want to really watch the process, but it's interesting because it's the dynamics of faculty and industry and curriculum and everything. And so coming up with a pathway and getting it in place. This should be an interesting one. We're going to follow that up with a presentation on Microsoft Teams, which has, it's got a package that became relevant very quickly in the COVID crisis, and some companies just flash cut. So what do our students need to know in terms of skills if they go to a company that is utilizing Microsoft Teams? And then finally, we're going to take a look at the Google career certificates. We started off with the Google IT certificate. Now there's a portfolio of certificates coming out and a whole employer engagement strategy that goes with it. So we're looking forward to those in the next few weeks. Today, however, we're going to hear from Peter Coffey, Vice President for Strategic Research at Salesforce. And he's a published writer in tech journals, and he's lectured at Stanford and Harvard Business School and Sloan School of Management, MIT, a well-respected prognosticator of the future. And I think at a time like this, his perspective, it helps us all. And this COVID thing, I've had people say, when it's over, we'll go back to normal, right? Well, I think Peter's going to give us some different ideas. Okay, Peter, I leave it to you. We want to know what's going to happen.
All right, if everything is doing what it's supposed to do, you should be seeing the Salesforce logo on a contour map background. And if we've got that done, I'll proceed.
You got it.
I'm getting the thumbs up. Fantastic. I don't know if any of you remember the name of John Templeton. Before Warren Buffett was the world's superstar investor, John Templeton ran the Templeton Growth Fund and was famous for the statement, the four most expensive words in the English language are "this time it's different," because so often he would become impatient with people who would say that math no longer applies, or that past rules of what constituted prudent behavior could now be safely ignored because quote, it's different this time. But more recently in May, David Rubenstein over at Carlyle Group said that among the biggest mistakes you can make today is failing to realize the degree to which this time it is different. And efforts to apply what people thought were their lessons learned from the financial crisis of 08-09, or even from previous public health emergencies, are requiring some circumspection, shall we say, because the degree to which this is now happening in a more connected planet with a more interdependent economy, with people who are better equipped to operate under circumstances of physical distancing, international collaborations, and so on. These are all substantially different, and I mean to the degree that the amount of bandwidth available on the planet, as I discussed with you the last time we were together, is order of 1,000 times what it was in 2007. And that is not just a difference in degree, that is a difference in the kind of behavior we have to expect. And questions like, well, what will the return to the cities look like? What will the university of a few years from now, very much on your minds, I'm sure, look like? I am not going to be here to to do a lot of rose-colored glasses things. The famous Winston Churchill phrase is, if you're going through hell, for heaven's sake, keep going. Among my concerns is that right now, too many organizations are still congratulating themselves on their pandemic response, which really should be in your rearview mirror. And when I'm asked, about this futurism thing, I say, well, what are the alternatives? A pastist would be someone whose rearview mirror is bigger than his windshield, and that's not a very safe way to drive. A presentist would be someone with the attention span of a mayfly. Futurist just means you're looking far enough ahead that you can walk around a hole instead of falling into it and congratulating yourself on digging out of it. And what we need to do in many organizations today is stop talking about how well you're doing with the pandemic and start talking about accelerating through it into what comes next. It's not a return to anything. It is an acceleration forward. It's time to notice that what we're needing to do right now, in almost every organization I know, people are already talking about doing this in the next few years. Every CIO with whom I've had a conversation like this has said, my 2-year digital transformation plan is not being delayed, it's being accelerated. I now have 2 weeks to prototype and 2 months to deliver what I thought we were going to be allowed to do over the next 2 years. And that's the typical kind of compression that I'm seeing. The idea that we'll turn back the clock, or that the reason we're in this difficulty is because we did certain things, so now we need to undo those things. No, that is not going to happen. It's not possible to return to domestic sourcing only. Rather, you have to develop a more diverse and resilient global sourcing strategy, not try to contract, but actually to further your expansion. In many cases, what you would want to go back to no longer exists, but in critical many areas, people now know they can have something better. And when people have discovered that at any point they could have simply made some behavior changes, we'll discuss those, or that technology changes could be delivered much more quickly than they thought. Someone said quite recently, when you realize that you can send all your people home and still be working the next day and do that over a period of 2 weeks, you start to wonder about all those other things you thought were too hard to do. And it's really given a lot of people a sense of a license to experiment, a license to attempt big, bold changes that they might previously have felt were too daunting to undertake. So for those of you who wondered when we were going to get to the title slide, here it is. We're going to be talking about the degree to which the pandemic represents an acceleration of change that was already understood, but maybe not yet credited. We're going to talk about how the digital foundations laid over the last 20 years have enabled this, realizing what's different this time, and readying not for a return to the normal of the last 10 years. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment, because really the normal to which we're going to return doesn't look like the 2010s. It looks like something a lot more dramatic and difficult than the 2010s were. And so that's what we're going to do. So let's get it done. Over the last 2 years, on average, I traveled about 200 days a year. I was flying everywhere. I was in Scandinavia, and then the following week was in Australia. It was a heck of a party, and it never made sense. It never made sense. We're doing what I'm doing with you right now. I can do this with 2 or 3 groups a day. When before, if I did 2 or 3 things like this in a week, it was a busy week. We've ratcheted up our ability to engage, but I grow impatient with people who say that the pandemic was not foreseeable. This is literally the closing credits scene of the movie Rise of the Planet of the Apes in 2011, in which in about 45 seconds while the credits roll, they say, oh yeah, by the way, a global pandemic takes place, and this is why the apes are able to take over the planet, thereby setting up the original movie. The notion of pandemic is not a shock to anyone outside the US and Western Europe, because in the Middle East and Asia, they've been through SARS, they've been through MERS, they know this happens. They were kind of baffled that we weren't more ready for this. But in March 10th, a cafe operator in the UK had this new word show up in their email for the first time, coronavirus, where they couldn't get their branded cups from China. And that's the way we were seeing it only 6 months ago. Oh, okay, gonna have a couple of disruptions, gonna have a few hiccups, gonna have to postpone some events. I was working with groups who were talking about postponing an April event to June, because of course, by June we'll be past this, right? They thought that was a shock and a disturbance. And as it turns out, now we're talking about June of, well, which year? Because June of 2021 cannot even be assumed to be a plausible date for anything like what we used to call a conventional live event. And so what happened just simply happened more quickly than people were prepared to handle. And I'm going to talk about a phenomenon that I call shockwave change, where the environment simply does not have the ability to adapt quickly enough, and so shock waves emerge. And we'll talk about some examples of that behavior. This reminded me of a quote that a friend of mine, Phil Wainwright in the UK, recently shared, a statement: there are decades where nothing happens and then weeks when decades happen. And I think everyone would agree we've been through a period of, what is it now, on the order of 30 or 40 weeks, when in a very genuine sense, decades have happened. The quote is actually sourced from a fellow named Vladimir Lenin, who was real good at making decades of change happen in weeks. By the way, footnote, since this is an academically oriented group, anyone who yells at someone that they're being a Marxist should reply back, you think this is a conversation about economics? Because Marx was an economist. Lenin took Marx's economics and turned them into an impetus for a revolutionary conversation. Marx was just observing that Uber drivers break even and suggesting that consequences might arise. Okay, they weren't Uber drivers, but you know what I'm talking about. Lenin was the one who said, yeah, we should put the Uber drivers in charge. And that's a very big difference between economics and revolutionary thinking. But Phil's comment is that we spent 20 years equipping the world with networking bandwidth, computational power, putting mobile devices in people's hands, getting them accustomed to the idea of engaging with things through websites and apps, and laying that foundation is why we were able to do this extraordinary pivot in a matter of weeks or at most months. And I'll talk about some examples of that later on. But the key point is that we have not demonstrated we can do this. We have begun the experiment. That is all we have done. Anyone who's saying, oh, look, we've proved we can do work from home. Well, you're all enough acquainted with research methodology that I'll point out the three things that are wrong with any such statement. Number one, the only people who can say they've been working from home successfully for years are people who in most cases demanded to be allowed to do that and then proved they could handle it. So there's a certain amount of sample bias there. The people who've been doing it en masse because it was imposed upon them have only been doing it for a short time. So there's what we might call novelty artifact there. They're still on the adrenaline rush. And the real question that has not been asked is, well, I've got an existing organization who know each other well, and now they're collaborating online. How is that a predictor of being able to hire someone, onboard them into an organization, make them familiar with the culture, and grow a company that 3 years from now is still functioning at any kind of level? And that is the experiment that has barely gotten underway. So be suspicious of any assurances that someone says, oh, that's okay, we've done this since March, we've got it. No, you don't. What you have is something that's wholly unrepresentative of the challenge that's now beginning. But the good news is that when people have a reason to change their behavior, it turns out they do. We had a conversation about this in May. This is actually the same conversation, I think, from the David Rubenstein quote that I shared a moment ago, where Wendy Redshaw over at NatWest Group said, all of a sudden, my 50 to 70-year-old customers are doing online banking. It's not that it got suddenly easier to do. It's just that when they no longer had the option of just walking down the street and walking into the office, and they tried it for the first time, they said, oh, well, this isn't so bad. And a whole lot of behavior changes happening right now simply because people got a big enough shove to get them out of their comfort zone, get them out of their detent. And when they try it, they discover this is pretty good stuff. That is maybe one of the most positive outcomes so far, is how many people are discovering that this digital stuff, this online stuff, even this AI stuff, really isn't the great big hairy mess of boogeymen that they were afraid it was going to be. But the nature of change is tricky. When you're sitting in an airplane doing 600 miles an hour, you're not really aware of the speed, unless you start getting close to the ability of the environment around you to adapt. That is to say, when you start approaching the speed of sound and the air in front of you starts to have a little trouble getting out of your way. And then things get a little bit bumpy. And you get a behavior that you really could not have predicted up until that point. And then the next thing you know, you're putting a sonic boom that is breaking the windows underneath you. And there are a number of challenges with this. Number one, You really don't know how a plane's going to fly in this regime by flying it slower and trying to, estimate upwards. It's a qualitative change. Number two, if you've ever been to an air show when a supersonic jet did a flyby, you have experienced this behavior that you literally don't hear it coming until after it's past you. And the notion that what we used to call leading indicators are no longer leading enough, and that by the time you have an understanding of the change that's about to happen, it's already taken place and you're sweeping up the broken glass. And building organizations that learn to look past the things they've always been able to use as leading indicators, to look over the horizon, so to speak, and understand root causes. For example, instead of waiting until the first expensive versions of a product are offered in the marketplace, which used to be your warning that maybe a more popularly priced version was going to come to market soon, that process now is so compressed that you actually have to be looking past that and looking into the research labs, looking at technologies that you might have thought are a long way from being productized, because the steps to go from research result to prototype to expensive product to mass market cheap product, when they happen in months rather than years, your mechanisms for dealing with that new competitive challenge or for finding the talent to execute on that opportunity simply can't have their knob turned up to 11. It's a different kind of behavior. I want to show you some examples of some shockwaves. This is road congestion in Chinese cities. It followed a very nice, predictable seasonal pattern around the time of Lunar New Year until that green curve in 2020 when suddenly it didn't come back. Not a forecastable behavior, a shockwave. There was a well-organized discipline of managing this kind of thing, and it just broke down. Similarly, the coal consumption at Chinese power plants, same thing. Seasonal behavior until this year, when post-COVID, that was a flat line. And it's not just things like cars on the road and watts being burned. It was also daily property sales in the 30 major cities in China, flatlined. And this is just going back to, January and February kind of timeframes. I could draw any number of other curves like this. Among the key observations is that this has been called the Nike swoosh recovery. It goes down fast and takes its time, sweeping back upwards. And I could show you the data from what happened when they reopened the pubs and the restaurants in the United Kingdom. They had closed, they'd gone down the elevator, so to speak, when they closed, but they're coming back the escalator or maybe even the broken stairway to climb back up. Because merely hanging a sign on the door that says, "Come on in, we're open," is not adequate. There are so many larger spheres of responsibility that have to be considered. Why should my customers come to the store if they're terrified of getting on public transportation? How can they come to the store if I've got a rule that says only one person per party can come into the store, but they've got kids in tow because the schools have not reopened? Many organizations are discovering that what they thought was their own readiness and preparation, and that what they now think is their own announcement of ready to re-engage, is completely inadequate, because there are so many larger concentric circles and overlapping clouds of concern and responsibility. And what this brings to mind is the limits on forecasting. I've made this clear, I think, that the ability to do forecasts in this situation is limited, that forecasting historically takes what happened before, throws some growth rates, positive or negative, on what happened before, puts some error bars on those estimates, and comes up with a prediction. And that's how forecasting works. Well, forecasting is very bad at dealing with substantially different possible outcomes. Will we have a working vaccine in a month, 3 months, or 2 years? Those are not, simple error bars around a forecast. Those are substantially different scenarios. My colleague Peter Schwartz, who I believe is credited with introducing this phrase of scenario planning when he was at Shell, has said we need to overcome the tendency to predict. This is a human behavior. We want to make a prediction, and then if we're being careful, we'll put some uncertainty on the prediction. And we almost need to divorce ourselves from the practice of attempting to predict, and rather instead get good at getting together and say, okay, what are the things that could go one way or the other and produce substantially different situations? And do we have strategies in place that will handle all of them, at least capably, and keep us in the game? Scenarios are a craft. You can do them usefully, or you can do them very badly and fool yourself that you're doing scenario planning. There's stories about tomorrow, and there's stories about the world around you. They're hypotheses, not predictions. They are plausible, and they're a framework. And I want to give you one of those simple examples that I think you'll find, quite relatable. If you walk into a casino and walk up to a roulette wheel, you probably know enough about roulette that if you put $100 on black and it comes up black, you just get back 1 for 1. And if you put 100 on black and 100 on red, there's an extraordinarily good probability that the next spin will come up red or black. It usually does. So whatever you lost on one, you'll win on the other, you'll redistribute your stake, and you stay in the game. Except that in a US casino, there are 2 slots that are green, 0 and 00. What that means is that if you do 13 spins, there is a 50% chance that in 13 spins, you'll get at least 10 or 00. And if you were doing that forecast that said red or black, 95% chance. Red or black, yeah, 95% chance. You keep going on the basis of that forecast. Once in 13 spins, you're effectively flipping a coin on whether you're completely wiped out. Not a good place to be. And it's never the forecast that you'll get a green on the next spin, but it's a plausible scenario that it will come up soon enough that you better have an extra 100 in your pocket so that you don't have to just leave the table with your pockets completely empty. That's what the discipline of scenario planning can do for you, is say, this is a low probability event, but protecting ourselves against it is straightforward and prudent and necessary. Now, the driver of everything that's happening, for good or for making things more complex and difficult today, is data. Hockey stick curves exist. The amount of data being created in the planet is following an exponential curve, as is the amount of data that's being retained and is therefore available for analysis, machine learning, statistical, or other analysis. Mastering data is not as cool and sexy and exciting as mastering the algorithms side. And when we teach people computing, we think we have to teach them programming, when actually teaching them an understanding of the nature of data is a more powerful skill. I can hire people to write code to manipulate data in ways I find useful. I need people who've learned what aspects of that data might have value, what stories it might tell me. And so in many ways, well-intentioned efforts to make people, as they say, computationally literate, focus too hard, and we'll talk about this a little later, focus too hard on teaching them to code instead of teaching them to come to grips with the mass and the velocity and the richness of the data that's really redefining the world. Data is different because we used to generate data as a side effect of our own activity. It arose near that activity, and we owned it, and maybe we would make some money by selling it. But the nature of generation and ownership of data was very local, and stitching it together was something you might do after the fact. Well, now most of the data that matters originates somewhere else. It originates in the behavior of a customer or in a connected device or any number of other things. And sharing data is now how you create value. Connectivity is inexpensive and cryptography is cheap. And so sharing data in very selective ways while still preserving confidence in its accuracy is now something that's relatively easy to do. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. And if we'd known we'd wind up here, we wouldn't have built these isolated citadels of data that we have to defend with elaborate security and then tie together with connections that we hope won't break that security. I mean, this is a massive business which is largely unproductive, and when it goes wrong, bad things happen. What we need instead is a question of how do we build data in networks that create experiences that people want to enjoy? I mean, when I go on a trip, my experience doesn't begin and end with getting on and off the plane. My experience begins with the place I'm at and ends in the place I'm at, my destination, and maybe arguably doesn't end until I get home. That whole experience end to end is the real product, which is why the United Airlines app on your phone has an Uber button in the United Airlines app. And think about the power that is to, on your arrival, United knows the gate and the terminal at which you arrived. So if you use the Uber button right there in the United app, you don't need to look around and say, what's the door number? How do I tell Uber where to pick me up? United already knows that. And that ability to to be the custodian of your whole experience is why building a network of data that matches the architecture of the experience you're creating is so important. And these are sometimes called blockchains. That's a special case, but everyone calls them blockchains generally. The general term is distributed ledger, and there's some other things that are not blockchain that have even more power than blockchain. But if you look at the way we do healthcare in this country, your doctor refers you to a specialist. Do they ever find out what the specialist did? Maybe, maybe not. Our own primary care provider suddenly stopped answering the phone, and when I went to knock on the door to make an appointment, their name was no longer on the door, and we tried for weeks to figure out where our doctor had gone. The best we could find out from the local physician community is that they thought she had joined a cult, and we literally have no idea where our family's medical records for the period of time that we were consulting that doctor may have gone. This is an example of a very badly broken system based on what used to be cheap and easy to do. But merely dropping blockchain technology into that system doesn't fix it. We need to take advantage of redesigning the system to use the ability to share data while still protecting its accuracy, to allow the network in a way to be the owner of the data rather than any single toll collector. So it's really important not to think that this is about learning how to do blockchains. It's really about looking at any system, education for sure. What is the difficulty that we face when someone needs a transcript and you need to go back to an institution with which you may have had no relationship other than sending them the occasional donation check? And suddenly you need to get an original document in an envelope signed across the back flap, because that's the only way anyone will call it an original, verified transcript. Well, we sort of have ways of doing this that don't involve that. We can put that record into a blockchain where you have the cryptographic privilege of disclosing that data to an employer or to a graduate school or whatever, and the integrity of the data is not in question. You cannot alter your transcript without setting off cryptographic alarms that says this data has been tampered with. Blockchains are not tamper-proof, but they are tamper-evident. And that is why education, as well as financial services and healthcare, are the three areas in which this is being most avidly explored. Every sector, it's not just healthcare, every sector needs to ask this question about how can I use this effectively, not just to create a new data storage mechanism in my existing broken process, but really rethink my process in ways that right now, if you sell something out of your 401k account or your 403, if you're in a nonprofit, it takes like 3 days to settle a securities transaction, right? If that kind of thing is done on a distributed ledger type system, the settlement time becomes about 10 seconds. And the Securities and Exchange Commission has already approved the introduction of systems like this. Try to imagine the impact this would have on your own ability to work in your retail account as an investor, or at the industrial scale, what it means when settlement times go from 3 days to tens of seconds. I want to give you another example of this, which is the ability to track products and know where they came from. Initially, as often happens, expensive products in luxury markets with very high volumes are going to be the places where the money is available. And so Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy is using blockchain type technology to address problems of counterfeiting of luxury goods. But don't get the idea that this is a niche thing that's only going to matter to them, because at the opposite end of the economy, you've got smallholder farmers in remote parts of the world producing specialized ingredients that go into your favorite craft beer. And they have had no financial identity. They haven't been able to be participants in an economy in which they were providing essential goods, but they were invisible. And they couldn't borrow money to invest in technology to improve their own ability to do their work. And so they just kind of functioned at an early 1900s level. And AB InBev has put these people on a blockchain type platform that allows them to go to their bank and prove with cryptographically authenticated data, hey, look, I've been selling to AB InBev for the last 10 years. I'm a good risk. And now they have the ability to get their first foot on the first rung of the ladder that lets them start becoming a more productive, probably a safer operation, and really start moving the generations forward. I think this is really inspiring. If there's one thing that technology has not been generally seen as doing, it's helping the people at the bottom of the bell curve move up. It's been fabulous for making, you know, the college educated more productive. But being able to push the technology out into the real world like this is tremendously exciting. And people who don't find a technology major attractive because they think it's just going to have them working in some cubicle for some, you know, heartless, socially toxic, you know, multi-platform social media tool or something, pointing out that this is the power to get out into the real world and make constructive change that really improves people's lives. I think it's a talk track that doesn't get as much attention as it could, and that examples like this, I think, really support. To visualize the growth of data, I can draw curves all day, but let me make it very physical for you. All the data in the world in 2017 was about 25 zettabytes. Don't even try to imagine what a zettabyte is. 60 of them today, 130 by 2024, but let's make it real. If all the data that you needed to master to know the state of the world in 2017 could be compressed into a golf ball, today you'd need an 8-ball. And in 4 years, you would need a baseball. And if you take a baseball and put it on a golf tee, I don't know any golfer who can look at that and say, yeah, I can drive that thing. No, you need a different tool, a different set of techniques. You're going to be playing a different game. Working with data of this magnitude is a new approach in many fields. Some people have called it the end of science because science used to be get your PhD, know enough to construct a meaningful experiment, go out and at great cost collect the data you need for that experiment, accept or reject your hypothesis, publish paper, and move on. Well, now the data is abundant, and asking the data, what do you know, is the essence of data science as opposed to traditional statistics. Traditional statistics requires you to be smart enough to come up with the question. Data science invites the data to tell you what questions might be worth asking. And that's why it's not just databases on steroids. It's an important understanding that the way you work with data that's in this kind of abundance and availability changes qualitatively. It's not just a matter of scale. What technology is going to make possible in this environment is only really interesting when several things happen at once. Any one thing happening, okay, I draw the curve and I can sort of see the impact. But when the things intersect, interesting things happen. You're probably already hearing, for example, about the move to so-called 5G networks. 5G is not just a faster version of 4G. Every G so far has pretty much just been turn up the knob, get a little bit faster. 5G is different because we push the computing out from the center to the edge, and now the network doesn't spend as much time passing around data that's boring. You really can't have baseballs of zettabytes running around when most of what they want to tell you isn't actually interesting. You have to start getting more selective. My favorite example of this is that if a Tesla drives down the street and its machine vision lets it dodge around a pothole, okay, that's kind of cool. But the fact that the next Tesla that comes down the street doesn't need to see the pothole, it already knows about that pothole because the previous one told the network and the network shared the knowledge. And now if my GPS says I'm anywhere within 10 yards of that pothole, my car is told, oh yeah, watch out for the pothole that's going to be ahead. This is a reality. If you are driving one of the most advanced Porsche or Rolls-Royce vehicles today, your cruise control is not merely maintaining your speed. Your cruise control knows that around the next curve is a steep uphill, and it's already anticipating the downshift based on things you can't even see. This ability to share information across the entire network means that the way we'll implement intelligent behavior in devices changes. Being really, really smart and not communicating with anything else doesn't work very well for people, and increasingly it's not the way machines will work either. So what we're going to expect, just in three words, we're going to expect more visibility. Data is going to come from more sources. You look at a Series 6 Apple Watch, this is no longer just a phone accessory. This is a wellness device that uses your phone as a control panel and a connection hub, but it's doing things like measure your blood oxygen and analyzing your sleep behavior. It's been a significant alteration of emphasis for that product. There's going to be more modularity. It used to be if you were building PCs, you got your chipsets from Intel, you got your software from Microsoft, and Claude Leglise, who was a VP at Intel, once told me, from now on, engineers get to pick the color of the box. There was very little room for innovation. If you look at what Apple is doing and what others are doing with technology from companies like ARM, they're now producing a chip that is not a general purpose, PC chipset. It's got tremendous amounts of specialized stuff in it to do things like understand your gestures on the screen, and to understand face recognition, and to understand speech, and the ability now to do real innovation without being the size of Intel. You can be a very small company now and use this intellectual property and then ship it off to a factory that will make you a few thousand of the things. And this is different. This is having an entry point into advanced technology that doesn't require you to be massively capitalized to get on the first step of that stairway. And that's a change in the nature of that industry. And what it means is that being able to do optimization and personalization at scale is the new definition. It used to be, if you're big, you competed on low price, and if you were small, you competed on personal service. Now the biggest companies can be personal, and the smallest companies can be cheap. And so the question of who's my competitor, what's my niche, becomes much less crisply defined. It's important to realize that along with these technical possibilities comes some society expectations. There's a piece of legislation that's been sitting in committee in the Senate since early last year. I don't know if realistically we can expect it to be addressed by the current Congress, but something like it will get passed soon. The one that's in consideration now is called the Algorithmic Accountability Act, and it would require companies to disclose details of how they generate and use data, and to file an automated decision system impact assessment, kind of like an environmental impact statement. And it's going to rip open a lot of things that currently are allowed to hide behind masks and say this is proprietary, this is trade secret. And we're going to have regulatory demands for visibility and understanding. We're going to see a company like DocuSign, which added more new customers in the first half of this year than in all of last year, being able to take an enormous number of processes that are currently paper-based, because now you can authenticate and you can non-repudiate a transaction. Any number of things now that will be handled with a digital signature in ways that are much more robust. Issues of provenance. People want to know, where did you get that? Apple's able to say things like, hey, we don't have any beryllium or mercury in our products. We responsibly source our coffee if you're Starbucks. We are not using any child labor in the production of our garments. There is more possibility now for customers to say, okay, I'm willing to pay a little bit more if you can prove to me this product is being responsibly manufactured, or if it's supporting American jobs, or for whatever reason. It becomes possible to de-commodify in industries that were just racing to the bottom for cheap price and generic product. And now there's much more room for people to say, this is the niche I'm going to explore, because I can do it cost effectively, and I can prove to people that what I'm offering them is something genuinely different. And another aspect of the current situation is a much stronger discussion of issues of fairness. It's been called the K-shaped recovery. It went down in a straight line for everybody, but now some people are slanting up and some people are still slanting back down again. What we are seeing is enormous attention to technology not merely making it possible for desk workers to have their desk at home instead of in the office, but to equip the first responders and the field service workers and the people who are letting the watts flow and the packets be routed and the food be on the shelves, that allows me to be doing this with you right now. And these are areas in which what used to be very technocratic kinds of conversation are going to have to inject more awareness and accountability to other stakeholders. Which brings us to another subject, which is that you can get through a lot on an adrenaline rush, but studies everywhere, literally from Antarctica to outer space, have shown that the halfway point is dangerous. Whether it's a 6-month tour of duty in the Antarctic or a 6-week submarine patrol, the halfway point is when you stop being excited by the fact that you can prove you can do it and start dreading the fact that you have to keep doing it. And what we are in right now as an American society in particular, because so many things have been done in such controversial and polarizing ways, is a situation where preserving a sense of shared purpose and commitment is going to be a challenge. And the danger is that people who can will drop out. And as Douglas Adams described in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, there was one fictional entire planet that just said, oh, let's just go into suspended animation and have the computers check the stock prices every day. And when the market comes back and other people have rebuilt the economy, then we can wake ourselves back up again and go back to selling our own high-priced services. Anyone who's perceived as sitting this out and letting other people do the scut work of rebuilding so that they can come back in and go back to partying is not going to be well received. David Brooks at The Atlantic has said there's a Pacific Islands nation that uses the phrase, my sibling from the same canoe, to describe someone who was with you when you were going through a difficult challenge. And that Churchill quote that I mentioned earlier is in the same vein. There's a need for institutions to prove that they can do more than take care of themselves and that they can use their spare resources, if they have them, to invest beyond their own borders in helping other people get back. This is also kind of like what the conversation between Walter Reuther of the United Auto Workers and Walter Chrysler got into a few decades ago, when Walter Chrysler was showing Walter Reuther the robots in the factory, and Reuther said, these are impressive, but none of them is ever going to buy one of your cars. And the need to be making sure you've built the ecosystem of suppliers who can give you the raw materials and customers who can buy the finished products. Absent that, how can you congratulate yourself for reopening your office or your factory? It's a completely useless achievement. My colleague Brian Solis has coined the term recently, Generation N, as in Generation Novel. It's a combination of Generation C, the connected people who create content and publish stuff on Instagram and Pinterest and share with each other and do more than just consume, with the people who are doing this driven by the consequences of pandemic. And he made the really important point that it's not just about responding to a crisis, but about demonstrating the ability to be adaptable to the next crisis, which could be of many different characteristics. In a lot of ways, we're returning to normal. We had 10 years and we could get away with building just-in-time supply chains that stretched across the Pacific Ocean. That was never a very robust or resilient way to behave. It was always a little dangerous and fragile. And McKinsey is now saying that companies in general should anticipate that you might have a multi-month supply disruption, order of once every 4 years, because of the degree to which we are so dependent on multinational supply. One study showed that I believe the number was 29 companies in 18 different countries collaborate to put a cup of Starbucks coffee in your hand at your local Starbucks store. Deutsche Bank looked at this in an even bigger perspective. They said, look, there's really kind of 4 big risks that can take out the global economy. Major pandemic, globally catastrophic volcanic eruption. We have had those happen. That's not a hypothetical. They can take out food production when they happen. A big solar flare, those happen all the time. One of them is eventually going to hit us closely enough to a direct hit that the GPS could be disabled, that the power grids could have significant effects, or of course the possibility of global war. Go check out what's going on in the South China Sea right now and you'll realize that's a potentially unstable situation. And their estimate, kind of like my roulette wheel comment, is that at least one of these is almost certain to happen in the next decade. And if you want to look ahead 20 years, that gets to be about a 5/8 chance. And so building institutions, hiring and training people and organizations to deal with a wide range of possible disrupting events is a discipline that really is going to need and get a lot more attention going forward. Dell has observed that their people want to keep doing what they're doing now. The creative destruction that the economist Joseph Schumpeter talked about is clearly upon us, and these things don't go backwards, they go forwards into this environment in which growing global collaboration, look at your Planet of the Apes closing credits if you don't know what I mean, is going to make this really, really an important thing to do. Now, among the questions that comes up is, well, how do I build a more intelligent organization? Because there are lots of definitions of the word intelligence. But oddly, one of the first was Alan Turing's so-called Turing test back in 1950, where it was really about, can you hold up your end of a conversation Now, one of the challenges is to build organizations that are not limited by what's been called Conway's Law, which is that whenever you try to do something, you wind up building a copy of your organization chart. Those 6 charts on the right, I've taken the names of the companies off of them, but a website called bunkersworld.net, said these are probably the organization charts of pick your favorite 6 high-tech companies. And you don't want your organization to look like this. And more to the point, if you want to do something your organization's never done before, it's arguable that your existing organization can't do it. That you have to be prepared to ignore or even tear up and redraw the org chart to reflect the new way of handling division of responsibilities and actions. Tony Blair said this quite recently. He said, you have to be prepared to ignore your org chart and just get the 6 smartest people in the company who've shown the most ability to deal with unfamiliar situations together in a room. Let them come up with what needs to be done and not let any existing silos or turf wars prevent that from going forward. It's not an easy thing to do. And in fact, perfectly good working airplanes crash all the time because there were people on the flight deck, each of whom thought the other one was taking care of something, or each of them thought they were supposed to take care of it, and they did it in ways that interfered with each other. So now there's an actual training discipline called multi-crew coordination to teach you not so much how to fly the plane, but how to collaborate with the other people who are helping you fly the plane. Because it turns out that's not something you can let people just pick up with practice. It requires thought. It requires intention to teach people to work this way. And you think about it, this is not the way most curricula are designed. Most curricula are designed to turn out excellent practitioners and hope that they'll learn to get along with each other as they acquire more experience. In fact, some people say, well, that's what grad school is for, when you start working in teams instead of just passing the tests individually. Pushing this idea down into the undergraduate period, I would say, is maybe the single biggest difference between the MIT I attended in the late 1970s and the MIT that my kids attended 3 decades later. And the degree to which they were working in multidiscipline teams, even as undergrads, was a significant factor in what they're all doing now. And this is not just for flying planes. This is also what's going on right now in the pandemic, as we discover that individually correct actions by various medical specialists do not always produce good patient outcomes. And that coordination is its own thing. It is not a side effect of doing individual right things. Boeing has said something very similar, and Boeing is demonstrating what happens when you don't have good coordination across disciplinary boundaries. They've had a lot of very challenging struggles in the last year, many of which were, I think it's becoming clear, the result of people in different parts of the company, each doing their job, but not really seeing the whole, not really seeing the forest. And so Mike van der Velde has said the real challenge is solving problems at global scale. Bill Gates is going to be in a conversation on Monday talking about, if you think the pandemic was tough, that's just a dress rehearsal for climate change in terms of a multinational problem with massive forces and long timescales for solution. Another expression that I'll share with you, Conway's Law describes org charts. Goodhart's Law talks about numbers. The danger of picking a number, once it becomes a target, it stops being a good measure. It becomes something where people try to game that measure instead of, and meet their target instead of solving the real problem. And my favorite example on this one is, if I reward you for making more nails, you'll make lots of little nails. And if I reward you for making massive pounds and weight of nails, you'll make railroad spikes, because that's just easier. The thing in the middle that you can actually use to build houses, you won't get that from either of those targets. The target you pick will not get you the behavior you actually wanted. Now, this brings up the subject of AI, because some people try to solve this with AI. And the problem with AI is that it's a bad adjective modifying an imprecise noun. So at one point I said, what does AI actually do for people? And I started making a list of verbs. And after I had the first 5 that began by coincidence with the letters A, P, P, R, and O, I said, oh, okay, I can call it appropriate intelligence instead of artificial intelligence. And now, instead of waving my hands and talking about, things that will do what people do, I can just say, this is going to help people do what people do. This is going to help people make better predictions, make better plans, optimize their behavior. When you get this in terms of concrete terms of the verbs of action and effect that this can have, I think the conversation becomes much more helpful. And it's something that I've used with many of our customers to say, let's not talk about artificial anything. Let's not talk about intelligence. Let's talk about outcome. Because acceleration is a vector. If you're using AI techniques to look at the last 3 years and use machine learning to predict next year, I don't think that's going to go well. Too many things have changed. But if you're using AI to look at data of what's happening right now and come up with predictions that aren't maybe unconsciously constrained by your past experience, well, that's a very good use of arguably the same AI-derived techniques. And you'll often hear me use the phrase, this isn't AI, this is an AI-derived technique. Because in the pursuit of machine intelligence, we've also produced some really good power tools that can be applied by people. And the other observation I would make is don't let your AI turn into automated inflexibility, which unfortunately is another thing you can spell with those same initials. So the 3 laws that need to be remembered, I've already mentioned Conway and Goodhart. The last one is the Bumblebee Tuna law of project names. Never name a project for a technology that it will demonstrate or deploy. Name it for the outcome you're trying to achieve. This is a rule that I recommend to anyone who says, someone come and say, we need to do a big data project. We need to do an AI project. We need to do an X project. Back up and say, why? What's the outcome? What's the problem being addressed? What's the goal that's being pursued? Okay, that's the name of the project. If the project is about student application completion improvement, because one machine learning exercise was tremendously effective in having students arrive on campus with their financial and medical paperwork all correctly done. They used machine learning to figure out what were the hiccups in getting that done, and a completely ridiculous wasted burden on the first few weeks of freshman year is students who show up with their paperwork not ready. And by using chatbots and machine learning techniques, one of the schools with which we work at Salesforce has cut those burdens by 1/2 to 2/3. That's a wonderful outcome. It's not sexy at all, but it's readily achievable. But it was an outcome called freshman onboarding improvement, not freshman admissions AI adoption. The question comes up a lot about code. Should people be learning coding? And there's a lot of folklore to the extent that learning to code is really important. It's computer literacy and so on. But this observation was made in a really good article in Wired recently that mastering data and learning the code you need to learn to answer questions with data will take you places that going out and learning code by itself will not. You learn code by itself to maybe do video games. But if you're trying to serve food to the homeless in your community, that begins as a data problem and gets a soupçon of code added to it. And the degree to which you need it mainly so you can look under the hood at open source tools and use things that are really cost effective to obtain, well, it's a matter of knowing enough. Knowing code matters even if you never write it, in the same way that understanding how your car works matters. Driver ed used to teach this. It doesn't anymore. Because if you turn the key in your car and the engine doesn't even turn over, it's useful if you can have an immediate reaction of, oh, okay, probably a dead battery. I'm going to go get a jump start. But if the engine cranks just fine and doesn't start, okay, the fuel tank is empty or the fuel line is broken or the fuel pump's not working. It's probably a fuel problem. And you'll go in a different direction and ask for a different kind of help. Now, if you're getting into a Prius and you push the start button and nothing happens, the system is completely opaque. It really doesn't tell you anything that gives you any guide to what to do next. You push the button that told the computer start the car, and the computer said can't. End of conversation. And that is among the only really good reasons why everyone should learn some code, is that it gives you that same level of one level below understanding that you need to figure out what to do next when something goes wrong, because most systems operate imperfectly most of the time. Most of us spend most of our time dealing with systems that aren't working exactly the way they should, and having an unconscious idea of, oh yeah, when it's not working like this, I should probably be steering in this direction to solve that problem. And then when the misbehavior is this other kind, and you're not even conscious of doing this most of the time, but when you can't do it, that's when you start to feel powerless and you start to be unable to get stuff done. Which is why if I were to make a list of the programming languages that I've had to write or in which I've had to debug other people's code, it would be a very long list. And yet the most important attributes of being a successful data scientist, according to one data scientist, are not whether you can write Python and R code, but whether you're compulsive, lazy, irritable, and insensitive to pain. Those are the tough skills to master to be an effective data scientist. Code is like, pencil sharpening. It's a useful thing to do. This is one of the few slides I may have shown you before where we talk about the difference between something like computational thinking and social intelligence, which are taught by collaborative laboratory type exercises and problem solving curricula, not by skills intensive curricula. Mike Tyson famously said, everyone's got to play until they get punched in the mouth. Dealing with the situation now where you get punched in the mouth a lot and are going to get punched in the mouth by supply chain issues, by meteorological issues, by public health issues, by issues of social division and that have been having such impact on our cities around the world this summer. Everyone's got to get good at continuing to remember what their plan was or quickly replanning. Dwight Eisenhower famously said, no plan is very useful, but the process of planning is invaluable. And another general once said, no plan has ever actually survived the first 15 minutes of contact with the enemy. But the notion that you're going to be in a continual mode of, okay, so what's the replan? What's the replan? Because if you're not making plans and measuring deviation from them, you don't have a feedback loop. You can't learn. Pat Gelsinger at VMware has put this in really crisp terms when he said, this current amazing pace of change that gets so much attention, this is the slowest it's going to be. Nothing's going to be this slow for the rest of your life. Everything is on exponential accelerating curves. And I'll give you one example, which is quantum computing. This is something we've been talking about literally for decades. And just in the last year, as much has happened as in the previous 20 years in terms of actually building machines that can reason in a way that's different than the von Neumann and Turing type computers that follow one thread of instructions, and maybe they branch at different points. But at any given point, they're only considering one possibility. Quantum computing can deal with multiple possibilities simultaneously and then condense the one that's interesting out of that fog in ways that are difficult to describe if you've never dealt with that kind of problem solving before. But what it means, among other things, is that everything we currently think we know about encryption is up for grabs, because quantum technique can break almost all existing codes almost trivially. And so we're already asking questions like, well, what's post-quantum cryptography look like? Why does that matter? Because if you're doing something today and you need to keep it secret for more than 3 years, you'd better be planning your security for a world in which quantum computing is readily available. This is one of those shockwave behaviors. You can't just wait for the first quantum computer to come on the market and say, okay, that's when I'll start encrypting my data in a quantum ready fashion. You have to be looking over the horizon and say, these things are already being demonstrated at an engineering level. It's no longer a hypothetical question, can they be built? They are being built. They're kind of small, expensive, and unreliable now. That's going to change very quickly. And so managing your data today for a quantum computing equipped world in a few years is not premature. It is a case where you have to be thinking in terms of these shockwave effects. The degree to which low-level physics, the kind of stuff that used to be only relevant to other physicists, is going to translate into marketplace impact in single-digit years rather than decades, is among the dominant forces that education has to equip people to handle. And also, so much of it is not just about the math and the science. Don't get me wrong. The math and the science are amazingly important, but the storytelling is key. If you want to change the way people think and behave, if you want to build a new business or change an existing business or other organization, storytelling skills don't become less important, they become more. We have a lot of problems today with people not wanting to pay attention to facts that make them uncomfortable, with people only hearing the stories that already resonate with them, and with media channels becoming very fragmented, so they're not even exposed to facts that an algorithm says I won't like. And turning anyone who wants to make meaningful change into the world, not just into a competent data manipulator. Now, I don't mean manipulation in an invidious way either. Data manager, data custodian, which are more positive ways of putting it. That's necessary. It's not sufficient. Being able to tell the story in a way that's compelling is important. And so there's an old concept, which I call urgency, hope, and glory. I was calling this for a long time before I discovered it's basically something called Freytag's pyramid. Tell a story. Get people's attention with, this is what has changed. You may notice I tried to do that today. I began with, I want your attention because what I'm about to tell you is important to know now, not next week, not next month, but you need to take action on it today. I began with the urgency. I led into the hope by talking about the availability of connectivity, networking power, the things that we can do with distributed data that allow us to solve problems in ways we simply could not years ago. And finally, glory. What's the resolution, or the revolution if you prefer, that takes you to a better place after you've undertaken all of this effort? Because that's really what gets people to undertake the risks and difficulties of change. And so if we look at the way we used to talk about what it was to be a good organization, a good company, a good employee, we'd say, oh, you got to listen a lot. Listening used to give you warnings. You could hear the oncoming plane. Today, it only suggests explanations. Oh, why is there all this broken glass on the floor? Oh, now I hear it. A supersonic jet passed overhead a few seconds ago, and now I'm hearing the noise. Well, that's only an explanation, and tomorrow that's not even going to provide an excuse. Tomorrow the question will be, why weren't you looking over the horizon? Why weren't you looking at the underlying science? Why weren't you looking at the underlying demographics? Why weren't you understanding what happens when you turn the key and the engine does this or the engine does that? And so the way we describe what's good performance needs a new vocabulary as well. We used to say responsive is good. And today you'll find people saying, oh, no, you don't want to be responsive. You want to be intelligent. You want to anticipate and prevent instead of just, break, fix behavior. Well, what I hope I've suggested today is that that's not enough. You need to acknowledge that there are substantially different, but in many cases equally possible outcomes, what someone called gray rhinos. They're not black swans, they're gray rhinos. You don't know when they'll come through the door, but when they do, you will not be able to ignore them. And building individual skill sets, building team coordination skills, building organizations and networks of organizations that acknowledge this and can deal with it effectively and not catastrophically, as arguably we've been seeing how badly this can be done on a planet-wide level over the last few months. That, I think, is where educators and practitioners in every field have their greatest ability to build the workforce and the academy that we need to make this happen. And I really appreciate the chance to share that with you today. Thank you all for the chance to be with you.
Well, that was terrific. I took some notes, and I don't really want to extend too long here, but if they have any questions, we'd be happy to deal with a couple. I was impressed. I had a lot of goosebump moments as you gave some of those quotes.
Like I said, I'm not here to make anybody comfortable.
Well, the things that really stuck with me was the scenario planning as opposed to predictions. And then I think you tied that together with a statement about resilience towards the end, because I
hope so.
Scenario planning and resilience are kind of like the two hands. And the, because when we were talking about how to train our students in the community colleges,
yes,
we have to ask ourselves, what's a basic skill anymore?
Yes.
The list has changed.
Yes.
And you gave a lot of good examples. I'm not sure we could put that list together right now, but I think we've got
so much of what we used to consider educational success was the transfer of subject matter knowledge. and the ability to pass an exam by proving that you had acquired that knowledge. And the math has been done on what's the half-life of the knowledge that you acquire in the course of your college degree. And it's, you know, that half of it will be obsolete within single-digit years of graduation. But a good experience will have taught you how to be a learner and a collaborator and an adapter and an explorer as a side effect of what you're doing. So when people ask me, is a college degree still important to the work you do at Salesforce? I'll say, I want to hire people who had college level practice in being around people who are as smart as they are and who can challenge them. Top talent doesn't usually come out of high school with a lot of experience being around other top talent. High schools, you know, don't do that. And the problem is I can't hire people who have never had an experience when they weren't the smartest person in the room. I need to hire people who are capable of readily figuring out, okay, he knows a lot more about this than I do, and she knows a lot more about this other thing than I do. So I need to figure out how to collaborate and synthesize with them. That's not a skill that emerges from being the smartest person in the room all through, you know, elementary, middle, and high school. That's the biggest contribution college can make, is by putting people in an environment where they're challenged and complemented and strengthened by being around people of comparable ability, but different areas of mastery.
You've given us a lot to chew on, Peter. I noticed in the comment section here, Richard Grodegut reminds us that you'll be speaking at the ICT Winter Conference, which I believe is in January, which
yes, I will.
Appeals to a lot of the same audience here. So I know a lot of you who like listening to Peter can do that. Also, this entire webinar is recorded, transcribed, and put together on our website, usually within a week. So if you have friends you want to share it with or whatever, and shoot them a little note, Nicole will be getting that information out, usually by next Thursday or something.
And number one, I certainly hope you'll cut out my brief interlude of trying to type in my 16-digit password. But number two, you may notice on one of the early slides, there's actually a Creative Commons tag. This is all Creative Commons attribution, no derivative works. Nothing here is Salesforce proprietary. My goal is to have these ideas be as widely shared as possible. So when you guys do the great job I've seen you do before of curating this into something that's consumable, I hope people won't feel that it's just meant, you know, for the people who are on the line today. I hope these ideas will be usefully and usably shared by as wide an audience as they can find.
That'll be good. Thank you, Peter. And thank you, everybody else, for joining us today. See you next week.